Yeah.
Well, sometimes other things come up.
Exactly.
And that's why we usually send out, within the next couple days, we usually send out an email that has a link to the recording, along with some other like supplemental materials in case people want to do a deep dive into anything that we're covering. So I will open the presentation. All right, these are our standard Zoom controls. Orientation. By now, kind of everybody knows how to do that, so I'm not going to linger on that too long. So we acknowledge that we are on the indigenous land of Coast Salish peoples who have reserved treaty rights to this land, specifically the Duwamish and the Snoqualmie Indian tribes. We thank these caretakers of this land who have lived and continue to live here since time immemorial. We also recognize that there are folks here who are joining us from other areas, and if you know the native tribes in your areas, feel free to pop those into the chat. We'd love to hear where you're from. And so this program is put on by the Issaquah History Museums. The Issaquah History Museums were founded as the Issaquah Historical Society in 1972, and we strive to discover, preserve, and share Issaquah's history and heritage. So usually in the normal times, we do that by putting up museum exhibits and doing in-person programming for both kids and grown-ups. But the pandemic has encouraged us to expand some of our options a little bit. And so we're happy to have you here with us during this virtual program. So I'm going to do some quick introductions now. Staff members are going to do a little wave when I tell who they are, so you can put some faces with some names. Karen Gath, our Programs and Volunteer Coordinator. She's also going to be acting as sort of our, I don't know what the word is, but she's going to be helping me when we take questions. Moderator, thank you.
There you go. There you go.
And that's Kayla Boland, our Administrative and Communications Coordinator. And Julie Hunter, our Collections Manager, is also here this evening. So thank you so much. And we're also joined by Doug Bristol, who's a longtime volunteer and who's going to do part of the presentation tonight. We receive sustaining support from the City of Issaquah, from For Culture, and from people like you. Thank you so much for signing up tonight. Your donation helps us. I probably don't have to tell you that we're having a challenging time during the pandemic, just like everybody else. And so we appreciate the support that you give us through your donations. So tonight our theme is Issaquah's natural environment. And so we're going to do a deep dive. Usually when we talk about history, we're talking about the last 200 years or so. So we're diving deep into the history of Issaquah tonight with some geology. So I am, this is not my forte, so I'm going to let Doug take it away. I am going to stop sharing and he is going to start sharing. And he is going to reveal all the secrets of Issaquah's unique geology. And we are set for multiple people to share screens. So Doug, you can take it away.
There we are. Okay, does everybody see that? Is anyone there?
Yes, we see it and we're here, but I'm going to mute myself now so so you don't hear any extraneous noises from me, but it looks like we're all good from here, Doug.
Oh, good. Well, welcome. We're going to talk about prehistoric geology and how Issaquah ended up looking the way that it is. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is this is the way Issaquah looks now. but it looked very different in times past, which we're going to cover, and it will look very different in times after we're all gone, I'm sure. But we're going to look at the prehistoric geology, and I'll tell you exactly why. I'll get rid of these controls here first. So what are the processes that made Issaquah look the way it does? There's an aerial of Issaquah, the Commons and the freeway over there in Gilman. So let's first look at what prehistoric means. Prehistoric means before written records were ever kept. And if you think of the 4.5 billion years that this planet has been recognizable as a ball of rock, humanoids in any form have only been around 2.2 million years, and what we call modern form humans have only been around 200,000 years, and all of written history is only 5,300 years. So everything else that we've learned about how Issaquah came to be has been learned by geologists from studying rocks, because that's the only thing that endures over time. Everything else disappears. So what are the geologic processes that have shaped Issaquah and the state of Washington and the entire Earth? Well, we have volcanoes, and we have earthquakes, and we have floods, and we have glaciers, and we have landslides. Those are all the major geologic events that impact us. Now, there are others. There are things like wind erosion and the heating and cooling of rocks that crack them, and tree roots pushing up things, but these are the major ones that are happening. And why are these all taking place? What's going on that is causing all these things to happen, that is causing us all the distress of an earthquake or a volcano or anything else? Well, let's first keep in mind that the Earth is smoother than a billiard ball. Now, if you stand out in Issaquah on Front Street and look around at the mountains, it's kind of hard to imagine that the Earth is smoother than a billiard ball, but it is. And here's all of the figures to support it, but really the only figures that are important is that from the top of Mount Everest to the bottom of the Marianas Trench, if it's as smooth as a billiard ball, it can't be more than 28 kilometers from the top of Everest to the bottom of the Marianas Trench, and it's actually only 19. So we are actually much smoother than a billiard ball, and that kind of, if our theme is our place in history, it gives you an idea of just how small all of us are compared to the planet. And all of these things, all the geology that has shaped Issaquah, has been done by plate tectonics. Now, that's the only geologic term I'm going to throw at you, and it's very easy to understand. I could throw a lot more geology at you because I have a geology minor in college, but that's way beyond the scope of our talk tonight. Tectonics is very easy to understand. Just picture that billiard ball that someone has taken a hammer to and broken the skin on. So it's broken up into pieces. And they're still attached to the billiard ball, just like the pieces of the crust are still attached to Earth, but they are all broken up. And there's just an example of the tectonic plates. And just to remind us again how small our place is, this is the Earth. It's got an inner core, an outer core, a mantle, and it's got this little sprayed on with a spray can crust. And that is where all the rocks and dirt and water and everything else is, and that's what we live on. And so again, you can see how small we are in comparison to the Earth. And if you watch the little video, you see that over time, these tectonic plates move around. And they've separated and formed into the continents that we recognize today. They started out theoretically, no one was there at the time, so we can only guess, but they started out because they look as though they fit together, and then they have moved apart. So let's bring it down a little closer to home. So we have Canada and the United States, and we're sitting, or we're riding on the North American plate, and it is traveling westbound. And the Pacific Ocean sits on top of the Pacific plate, and it is moving eastbound, so they are crashing into each other. And these are the types of things that cause all of the geologic events that we are used to seeing in our lives. And we have our own little special plate, which is the Juan de Fuca plate. It's a remnant plate. It's not important what that is, but it is being crushed between the Pacific plate and the North American plate, and it's right offshore. So if you're standing on the beach and looking out at the ocean floor right out in front of you is the Juan de Fuca plate. Now, how much do these plates move in a year? Well, they move about 3 inches a year. So the little video there is how much your nails grow in 3 months. So if you just extend that out 4 times, you'll see that they grow about 3 inches, and that's about how much the plates move. But there is so much weight to them and so much friction and so much geologic stress involved that 3 inches is quite an amazing amount of distance for that much to be moving. So geology is circular. So we have Earth's crust is broken up into tectonic plates, and the tectonic plates move around, and they cause all the geologic events like earthquakes and volcanoes and other things to occur. And when those occur, they relieve stress on the tectonic plates, and the tectonic plates start to move again, and they cause the geologic events to reoccur. So we have a circle of causality. So now we understand that what is causing Issaquah to look the way it does is caused by tectonic plate movement. Now let's get a little into geologic time. The only really important thing you need to know about geologic time is that it's way too vast for anybody to get their arms around. So I say, we've been on this planet for such a short time. It's hard to imagine that there have been 1.6 trillion sunrises and sunsets, and that there have been 7 ice ages. When we think of the ice age, we think of the very last ice age, which, by the way, we are still in. But there have actually been 7 of them, and one of them, the second one, was so huge that it's called the snowball ice age by geologists, because the entire Earth is covered with ice from each pole up to the equator. So we are in a geologic ice age right now. We just happen to be in an interglacial period where the ice has retreated for a while. So we need something that we can wrap our arms around to get a feeling for geologic time. So let's look at the One World Trade Center. Beautiful new building. Shows the resiliency of the United States, that it won't give in to terrorism. It's 1,776 feet tall in honor of the date that our country became a nation. And it's hard for us to exactly see how big it is, although we can get our arms around how tall a building is. But if you stand next to it, it's still pretty difficult. And not many of us have had the opportunity to stand next to it because we don't often get to New York, especially during a pandemic. But we've all stood next to the Space Needle, and it is as tall as 3 Space Needles standing one on top of the other. So now you can get a feeling for how big that building is. But let's not think of it as a building. Let's think of it as geologic time. So down at street level is the beginning of the Earth, which is 4.5 billion years ago. And the very tip top of the antenna on top of this building is us tonight having this conversation. And if you want to know how long humans have been on this planet, we're equal to 1 piece of notebook paper laying on the very tip top of that antenna. And everything else happened a long time before we ever got here. And the only way we can learn what happened is by studying rocks, again, because that's all that's left. And that's what geologists do. And Washington and Issaquah and the other areas in Western Washington are especially difficult for geologists to understand because there are so many different geologic terrains. So if you compare that to the state I grew up in, which is Illinois, which is flat as a board, there are only 19 geologic terrains. And next door, I only live 15 miles from Iowa, there are only 9 geologic terrains there. In Washington state, by comparison, there are 274 different geologic formational terrains. And so just figuring out the geology of the Issaquah area and the rest of Western Washington is very, very challenging. So how did Western Washington form? If we're going to figure out how Issaquah formed, we better know how Western Washington formed. Well, 450 million years ago, there was no Washington. If you wanted to buy some beachfront property, you had to buy over by Spokane because that's where the coastline was. But as the plate tectonics did their magic, more and more land began to get shoved up. And eventually we had what looks like Washington. And then ice came down. I'm just showing the 7th and last ice age that we're still in. And to give you an idea of just how serious even this minor ice age was, which is the 7th one, there were 2.5 million, or 2.5 miles rather, of ice sitting on top of Seattle, 2.5 miles thick. But it eventually went away and we were left with some recognizable features. Here's the Hood Canal, Puget Sound, so forth and so on. So now let's look and see what exactly is happening in Washington. So we have Puget Sound, or we have the ocean out here at sea level. And you can see here are the Olympics. And as you can see, most of the Olympics are underground. They're being shoved up by the Juan de Fuca plate being pushed underneath the North American plate. And the Olympics grow at about 4 inches a year. So not very much, but they are still growing. And you can see Puget Sound is hardly anything. So we look around and we see Squawk and Tiger and Cougar Mountain and the other various features of Puget Sound. And really, they're nothing on the geologic landscape. And then we have, of course, our volcanic range of the Cascades. All this pressure of all these tectonic plates moving around causes a rock to melt and move around. And it has to go somewhere, and where it goes is it blasts out the top of these Cascade volcanoes. So we have Mount Baker, we have Mount Rainier, we have Mount St. Helens, which blew its stack in 1980, and we have Mount Hood all the way down to Mount Lassen in California. And all of these are active or semi-active volcanoes. And if you don't think it's that close to home, now, we used to camp quite a bit when the kids were young, and we camped at White River Campground. And then in the early 90s, a hole appeared in the side of Mount Rainier, and steam and liquid began to come out of it, and they closed the campground because the campground is built on the debris from the last time that hole opened. And they kept it closed for a year, rather amusingly. Then the bean counters got a hold of things and realized all the revenue that they were losing by having White River Campground closed. And so they figured that a sign only cost a couple of $100. So when you go into the White River Campground now, there's a big sign that says camp at your own risk. And everybody was allowed back in. And all this basalt that's laying over here is just stuff that has come out of the volcanoes and has coated the Columbia Basin. So now let's look at the Pacific Northwest. So you have Puget Sound. Puget Sound's a little under 600 feet deep, and it's of course at sea level. And if you leave the ferry dock, you run immediately into Seattle. And Seattle is a ridge of glacial debris that was left from the last ice age. It's 440 feet tall. You either have to go through it via the I-90 tunnels through Mount Baker, or you have to go over it by driving up James and coming down to Leschi. Or you can go through a canyon that was dug between downtown Seattle and Phinney Ridge and Mount Baker, which has a road that you can drive on. But one way or another, you have to get over and out of or under Seattle. And if you do that, you come to Lake Washington. And Lake Washington is a little over 200 feet deep. You can't build a suspension bridge like San Francisco because one, the water's too deep. 218 feet deep is too much for construction methods to be applicable to that. But more than that, there's 600 feet of goo and rock and sand and everything else on the bottom of Lake Washington, which would make for a very unstable set of towers. So we float bridges instead. And if you leave Lake Washington, which is only 16 feet above sea level, you go over the east swell. And this is when you're driving toward Issaquah. You start leaving Lake Washington and you start climbing, and it's about 400 feet high. And then you top out on it and you see Lake Sammamish and the Sammamish Valley and Issaquah down below you. And you arrive at Lake Sammamish. Now here we get into some real Issaquah geology, because this is Lake Sammamish, and if you look at it, it kind of has an exaggerated backwards S formation to it. That's the way the lake looks. But it didn't used to look that way. It used to look this way. And what caused the change? Well, there were huge landslides. And those landslides pushed debris into the lake and gave it the shape that it has today. So if you're living in those areas, you're living on a landslide. And then we arrive at Issaquah. Issaquah is a valley, but it's also a plateau. And it's only 100 feet above sea level. So you see, we aren't that far above the ocean, but we have, luckily, these two big 400-foot debris ridges that protect us from a gigantic tidal wave or whatever might come and get us. But we haven't really climbed or gone that deep. And then we leave Issaquah, and whoa, there's a giant barrier. And the giant barrier is, of course, the Issaquah Highlands. And the Issaquah Highlands is at 1,100 feet. So when you drive up that very steep, very long road from downtown Issaquah to get up to the Issaquah Highlands, you're climbing 1,000 feet. And to give you a perspective on that, the hospital is at 850 feet, the Swedish hospital. So you can see how fast you climb and how big that Issaquah Highlands is. And then you get to High Point, which is even bigger. It's 1,700 feet in elevation. And luckily for us, we have a valley that goes past these two, where I-90 goes. And so we don't have to drive up and over them. We can bypass them through a canyon. And then you come to Preston, which is a little plateau on its own. And you come to Falls City, we're back to 100 feet again. So you've got this big barrier that separates us from the Snoqualmie Valley, and here is the Snoqualmie Plateau. And now you see why Snoqualmie Falls is in existence, because it falls off the edge of the Snoqualmie Plateau and heads for Falls City. And then we have North Bend and then the Cascades. So this area we refer to as the lowlands. And then you have this gigantic ridge here, and then you have Snoqualmie Valley. So just a short review. Earth smooth as a billiard ball. Plate tectonics have cracked the skin. If you bring the size of the Earth down to the size of a billiard ball, we are just microbes crawling around. And as we can see sadly from the pandemic and from other events, if we disappeared tomorrow, the Earth would go right on without us very happily. We are just little tiny things crawling around on the Earth. And we learned that geologic time is huge and that our place in it is very small. And things only look big to us because we are so tiny. So, what's been happening in Issaquah in the last 50 million years or so? Well, 50 million years ago, Issaquah was a swamp. We were in an interglacial stage like we are now, where things were warm enough that the ice melted away. And so it was a cool swamp. It wasn't a swamp like down in Narlands or places south in the south. It's a cool swamp. The temperature was about the same as it is now. So if you can kind of picture that big pool right there is kind of the intersection of Front Street and Sunset Way. And it stayed like that for about 20 million years. Nothing much happened except that there were all kinds of plants growing up and dying and being buried by other plants that came up after them. And that happened millions and millions of times. And over time, all that vegetation got compressed down and initially turned into what we call peat. And peat is a heat source. In olden times in the UK, they used to dig it out in big yard-sized cubes, and they'd let it dry, and then they'd burn it. And it didn't produce a lot of heat, but it was better than freezing to death. But as more and more time passes, you can see the time arrow right here, it gets crushed down further and further, and it becomes lignite. And lignite is often called the worst form of coal, because it still has a lot of plant material in it. It produces more heat than peat, but it is not true coal yet. And then as more time passes and more weight comes down on it, we get more and more compression, and we finally get coal. So in Issaquah, 13 coal beds exist, and they've been laid down by during this 20 million year period. And in between them is mostly sandstone and siltstone and shale. And sandstone is created when salt water is involved. So during times when this area was covered with ocean. And siltstone is when it was covered with fresh water. And shale was kind of in between, when it was dry enough to produce a rock, but it's a particular kind of rock that kind of scales off. And those coal beds just kind of laid here for 15 million years. Not much happened to them after they finished forming. Nothing was happening geologically. Things was pretty quiet. So for 15 million years, which is a very long time, they just kind of laid there until mountains started pushing up. And these are the mountains that are familiar to us, although they wouldn't have looked the way they do now. So the Issaquah Alps, which actually have a geologic name, but it's not important because everyone calls them the Issaquah Alps, got pushed up, and they were on average about 6,500 feet high. So if you want to know the sequence of mountain building, the Issaquah Alps are the oldest mountains, and that's why they're only about 2,000 to 3,000 feet high now, because they've had the most time to erode, to have themselves washed down to where they are now. Then the Olympics came up, and then finally the Cascades are the youngest mountains. They're only about 5 million years old. So here we have Issaquah. We know now that it sits down in a valley, and what do we have around it? Well, we've got the Eastgate Swell, and we've got Cougar Mountain, and we've got Squawk Mountain, and we've got Tiger Mountain, and we've got Taylor Mountain, and we've got High Point, and we've got the Grand Ridge, and we've got the Issaquah Highlands, and we've got the Sammamish Plateau. So you see that Issaquah is in this beautiful valley, and it's been made beautiful by all this upthrust of all these mountains that we love. And of course, we have Lake Sammamish sitting here. But Lake Sammamish wasn't always the way it is now. Lake Sammamish looked like this. It was much, much bigger. And how do we know that? Well, we can trace the shoreline of Lake Sammamish all the way around these hills that surround us. So we know exactly how high it was. And how did it form? How did all that water appear? Well, first of all, the Ice Age came down and filled up this valley with ice. In fact, it filled up the entire state of Washington, as I mentioned, over 2 miles thick of ice. Then it gradually melted as we entered an interglacial period, and it turned into a lake with a big ice plug at the south end. And the ice plug ran from Poo Poo Point, for those of you who are familiar with the geology of the Hobart Valley, and over to Squaw Mountain. But it was about 3/4 of a mile thick. It was about 350 feet high, and it was made of solid ice. And that was just because it had been so compressed by all the other ice sitting on top of it. And just to give you an idea of the total geology here that we're talking about, there was actually another giant lake just on the other side in the Snoqualmie Valley. And there were 3 rivers that ran between the glacial Lake Snoqualmie and glacial Lake Sammamish. And we know this because, and you can still see them today, if you go up there, there are 3 abandoned gravel pits. And the reason the gravel pit was there is because that's where the gravel was. And that's because as the rivers ran, they deposited gravel there. So 3 rivers that fell down into glacial Lake Sammamish. But the ice began to melt over time, and plug finally gave way, and all that water in what geologists estimate is in a single day, because ice, just like when you see ice in your drinks, you see the ice keeps its form for a while, and then all of a sudden it'll just go, and that's what happened to this ice plug. All the water went tearing out of here. What it did as it left is a whole nother geologic discussion, which is beyond our scope tonight. Just take my word for it that all this water poured out. And we were left with what we have today, which is Lake Sammamish, Issaquah, and the surrounding communities and the surrounding hills with communities on them that are what we recognize today. And we also find fossils here. So if you're not familiar with the fauna of Lake Sammamish, I can tell you that right down by where Tippett's Creek comes in and where Issaquah Creek comes in, there are little tiny eels. They're about 6 to 30 inches long. They don't bother humans, and all they want to do is get away from humans. But when that lake was 300 feet deep, the paleontologists have found evidence that these eels were 35 feet long and about 5 feet in diameter. So I don't think you want to go swimming in glacial Lake Sammamish. So that is our prehistoric geology of Issaquah and how it came to be. And the final shot is just a graphic demonstration of how all the area around here is plateaus, and there's Snoqualmie Falls falling off the very edge of the Snoqualmie Plateau. And that's it for me.
I'm still thinking about those eels, I've got to tell you. Those 35-foot long eels.
35 feet. Yeah, I don't really want to go swimming with them.
No, me either. Well, Doug, thank you so much for that. That was really interesting and answered a couple questions I had. I wanted to throw this in here at the end. So this is actually the oldest artifact we have in our collection. It is a fossilized tree, which was created somewhere between 35 and 47 million years ago. And it was found on at a home in the Issaquah Highlands. They were doing some digging, hit something that looked a lot different than the earth around it. The guy who owned the house happened to have a geology background, and so he was able to identify it. And it was part of a deciduous tree that was fossilized after a volcanic eruption, and he donated a piece of it to us. So that's the oldest artifact that we have in our collection. And I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about, I think when you think about Issaquah and you think about the, the natural environment there, you think about the Issaquah Alps, and then you also think about the Issaquah Creek, which runs through the center of Issaquah pretty much. So this is a picture of Issaquah Creek in a wide, low spot near Gilman Village. So over the centuries that people have lived in the area of Issaquah, the creek has been a constant and critical part of survival. So for early Native Americans, the creek provided food. They located the Native American groups who lived here were the Lashute culture group, and two of the tribes that were here were the Duwamish and the Snoqualmie. And so a longhouse was built at the mouth of Issaquah Creek, where it entered Lake Washington, and that was a seasonal place for the Native American groups to spend time. And of course, the Lashute people relied heavily on both salmon and cedar, which are prevalent in this area. So early white settlers to the Issaquah Valley would have been able to take advantage of the rich soil that a regular floodplain provides. And some of the people who lived here, some of the early settlers, harnessed the creek for things like operating a lumber mill and creating log flumes to send lumber into specific directions. So the creek has suffered over the years from the pollution and some of the ill effects of heavy logging in the area. But it's also been the focal point of a number of the parks in Issaquah. So from Lake Sammamish State Park to Sana Park, Burnson Park, Confluence Park, all of these parks feature spots where you can enjoy the Issaquah Creek and watch the salmon and that kind of thing. Obviously, the creek has long inspired photography. It's also inspired artwork. This is a piece of art from the 50s or 60s called The Hunters of Issaquah Creek. Issaquah Creek has also been the focus of conservation and preservation efforts going back to the 1960s. And so before we start talking more about conservation and preservation, I just want to talk a little bit about the geography of the creek, where it runs in Issaquah, where its headwaters are, that kind of thing. So the headwaters of the Issaquah Creek are in the Issaquah Alps that surround Issaquah, and the health of all of these different hillsides, you see the different mountains where small streams run and feed into Issaquah Creek. So the health of those hillsides has a lot to do with the health of the creek, and the ecology of the whole area is really tightly bound together. And so it's hard to think about things separately. Ruth Kees, who we'll be talking about a little bit later, was a conservationist here in Issaquah as far back as the 60s. And she said that we really shouldn't talk about being from Issaquah. We should be coming from the Issaquah Valley Basin, where the Issaquah Creek runs. She saw us as living in watersheds rather than living in towns. And so we'll talk a little bit more about her in a little bit. So moving into Issaquah, you can see at the upper left, Lake Sammamish, and you can see the mouth of Issaquah Creek. And then as we flow a little bit farther upstream, you can see that the creek goes through the Lake Sammamish State Park. It runs down through basically the Pickering Farm site, which is also where Costco is, where the Issaquah Farmers Market is held. And at about that point, it splits, and you see the North Fork of the Issaquah Creek moving off to the east and kind of north of the frame. And so moving into the downtown area a little bit more, hopefully you see a few sites that you recognize that'll help you kind of locate yourself. So again, the North Fork is flowing north and eastward. Over here where the Issaquah Coffee Company is located, of course, that's Gilman Village, and this is where the main branch of the Issaquah Creek continues. Confluence Park is named for the confluence of a number of things, but also the East Fork with the main branch of the Issaquah Creek, and they come together there. You can see where the East Fork travels off to the east, hence the name East Fork. And then down to at the bottom, you can see the site of the fish hatchery. And just to give you an idea, a little bit of what the creek looked like in 1913. This is a picture that was taken by Mary Wold, and she lived on the Wold Farm, which is now part of Gilman Village. And so that's just a little bit, just to get an idea of what some of the plant life and so on would have looked like. So bumping a little farther south into the downtown area, you see the site of the Issaquah Salmon Hatchery. The salmon hatchery opened in 1937, and it took advantage, obviously, of the location of the creek running through town to serve as a salmon hatchery. And at that time, the main concern was hunting and fishing. Well, fishing mainly. You don't hunt for salmon, generally speaking. So, they were concerned with increasing the number of salmon in local lakes for fishermen. Today, the mission of the salmon hatchery is more ecological and conservation oriented, and has a lot more to do with stream health and the survival of the salmon species. So this is a early bridge that went over Issaquah Creek. This is the bridge that the coal miners crossed on their way up to the Issaquah coal mines where they worked. And this is not a terribly old picture, but you can see farther south on the route of the creek. This is the 1936 dam that was installed on the creek. And it was meant to provide water for the Issaquah Salmon Hatchery. And so the dam had a fish ladder attached to it, but it was too narrow and too steep to really be useful to the salmon. And so this was sort of a not terribly happy spot for the salmon. So either they got frustrated and would turn around and swim back downstream, or they would get stranded in some of the water and not be able to continue upstream. And so this is kind of a choke point. And above the dam, there are 11 miles of upstream habitat that it was really critical that the salmon be able to take advantage of. So in 2014, after some years of fundraising and doing preparatory work, they were able to take the dam out and replace it with a series of more friendly salmon weirs that the salmon could wend their way through. So a few other pictures from the 1930s that kind of show what the creek looked like at that time. It doesn't look the way that we see it today. It's pretty barren. If you look at some of the fine print at the bottom, these are state of Washington photographs, and you'll notice that it's got a note that says north side of Issaquah showing filling, preventing further washout. So there had been some efforts to engineer the creek and get it to not flood. Here's another picture that shows where the ground has been cut away along the edge of the creek. And of course, that's formed from erosion. And generally, we don't see a lot of vegetation near the side of the creek. It looks pretty barren. So shifting gears a little bit, so that's where the creek is, what it's looked like a little bit over the years. And then we want to talk about what it's like living with a creek that goes through the middle of your city. We're very fortunate today to have as many beautiful creekside parks as we do. But the flip side of living so close to a creek and having a creek in a city area is that you're subject to flooding. So it's interesting and perhaps not surprising that I find more evidence of flooding in the Issaquah Press after Issaquah started to develop rather than before. Part of that is that there's just more things for people to be bothered about with extra water coming over them. And part of it is that the actual development does contribute to an increase in flooding. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. So, and this could have been a presentation about flooding and pictures of flooding from every year that we've had flooding in Issaquah. But as I was researching flooding and I was researching Issaquah Creek, there was somebody that kept surfacing, so to speak, bad pun, and her name was Ruth Kees. So I'd like to introduce you to Ruth. She did an oral history with us in 2006, and I did a deep dive into, actually she did 2 interviews with us, and I did a deep dive into those to learn a little bit more about her, because so much has been written about her advocacy for the Issaquah Creek and for water in the Issaquah watershed in general. So Ruth was born in Beatrice, Nebraska. It's spelled Beatrice, but it is pronounced by the locals as Beatrice. So she was born in Beatrice, Nebraska in 1923. She described her background as being one of both ecology and empathy. Her family was a farming family, and she felt like she learned those traits from her parents. She worked during World War II, and then after the war, she and her sister pooled their resources and they bought a Piper PA-12 airplane. And so this is in the 1940s, mid-1940s, 1945, 1946. And so they would, it was a 3-seater plane, so it's room for the 2 of them and maybe one more person if they were feeling kind. And when our oral historian asked her where she flew in the plane, she said, all over, it was our magic carpet. And she went on to describe a number of the journeys that she took. And that's actually how she met her husband. He needed a ride from Nebraska to either South Dakota or North Dakota, and she was it. So she took him on a plane ride, and that's how they met. So the Kees moved to the Issaquah area in the 1950s, and both of them were working for Boeing at the time. And together they built their dream home on Tiger Mountain. It was a beautiful rustic home that featured a lot of natural river rock and a lot of natural wood, and was just by all descriptions just an incredible house, and is still standing. I shouldn't speak of it in the past tense. And so it was not long before they moved here that Ruth's interests and concerns turned to water conservation. Some of the things that she was known for is keeping rainfall statistics. She kept rainfall statistics for more than 20 years, and she shared those statistics with the Department of Ecology, Washington State Department of Ecology. And for a long time, it was also reported in the Issaquah Press. She was concerned about surface water, but not just surface water, the creeks that ran through Issaquah. She was also really concerned with the aquifers and development and their impact on local aquifers. She saw the growth and development of Issaquah as being inextricably linked to an increase in flooding. And so you might ask, if you don't know much about this subject, which I didn't, what does development have to do with flooding? Well, one of the ways that Ruth illustrated this, first of all, the more development you have, the more impermeable surfaces you have, the more water runs off instead of soaking into the soil. And that's also the problem with losing a lot of trees in an area. That increases erosion, it increases runoff, and it moves the water into lakes and streams instead of having them soak in and replenish the aquifer. So one of the things that Ruth pointed out to our oral historian was that Lake Sammamish used to be a static lake, meaning the level didn't rise and fall a lot. It stayed pretty much similar. Now, she said in her oral history, you can see the level of the lake changing regularly by the way water rises and falls along the many docks on the lake. And this just never happened before. And that's because of increased runoff. So that all the water has just poured into Lake Sammamish instead of going into the ground where it will replenish the aquifers. So, and Ruth was pretty big on reminding people that the aquifers were where we got our drinking water in Issaquah. In 1987, Ruth and a number of other people formed the Issaquah Environmental Council. Because of her stewardship and supporting clean water, and the stream near her home, which flows into Issaquah Creek, was named Kees Creek after her and her husband. Ruth was also one of the founding members of the Issaquah Alps Trails Club. So some of her advocacy work goes way back. One of Ruth's earliest battles was with Weyerhaeuser in the 1960s. So Weyerhaeuser owned large swaths of the Tiger Mountain forests, and they would go in and do clear cutting. And one of the things they did when they did clear cutting was that they would spray a kind of an exfoliant that would kill all the saplings and the plants and that kind of thing. And of course, that those products would end up in the water system and then end up in Issaquah Creek. So Ruth and her folks that she gathered to go protest with her were not happy about that. And they showed Weyerhaeuser how the land could be cleared by hand just as easily and quickly and without the poisonous products. So she gathered up, by calling around and by putting notices in the Issaquah Press, she managed to get as many as 200 people to show up on the days when they were talking about clearing up at Tiger Mountain and do this hand clearing work that was so much better for the forest. And so Ruth obviously was a person who deflected credit rather than took it. And so she deflected credit for the Tiger Mountain State Park to Harvey Manning, who of course was one of the founders of the Issaquah Alps Trails Club, and the Public Lands Commissioner at that time, Brian Boyle. And she told the story, and apparently it involved Harvey Manning having Brian Boyle come out and see Tiger Mountain State Forest, or the place that was to become Tiger Mountain State Forest, show him how beautiful it was, and then took him into the Rolling Log Tavern for a beer to seal the deal. Now, I'm not sure what the magic was about the Rolling Log Tavern, but apparently it's a very important part of that story. The Rolling Log is the longest operating bar in Issaquah, and it's been around since about 1934. So the Tiger Mountain State Forest became an official state forest in 1991. Ruth did other work on the East Fork of the Issaquah Creek. So she told this story during her oral history as well. During the construction of I-90 in the early 1970s, the highway department basically relocated part of the creek, and they built a system of weirs for the little salmon to go through to get back to where they were going, to get out to the ocean. Well, some of the little fry were too small to navigate all these weirs. And so Ruth organized a group of school kids, and they went out with dip nets, and they actually picked up the little fry and moved them to parts of the stream that were going to be more navigable for them. So literally saving fish out of the creek. In either 1978 or 79, Ruth formed the Friends of Issaquah Creek. And as this newspaper article from the Issaquah Press discusses, she was able to secure funding through the Clean Water Act and do habitat restoration and rehabilitation on the East Fork, which up until that time had been described, as it is here, as very neglected. So we have her to thank for the contemporary health of the East Fork. One of the biggest battles here in Issaquah, and there were a number during the times of fast development. This happened in the 1980s, and this was the battle over the Pickering Farm site and what was at that time the Skyport. So this is a map that was prepared of the site of the Pickering Corporate Park, and you can see there's a circle right here. And that was a track for horses. You can see the area that where the Issaquah Creek ran, kind of wending its way through here. And we can see that we've already got some stuff that's been platted over here on the other side of the creek. But the rest of this was just a field, and it was a big cow pasture. So this is a subject that we're going to examine a little more in an upcoming virtual exhibit. But the short version of the story is that the Pickering family had kind of reached the end of their rope when it came to dairy farming. The USDA had put a lot of new regulations in place after World War II that made it much, much harder for a small farm like theirs, like under 100 head of cattle, to really make a profit because they couldn't keep up with all the new regulations that they would have to stick to and all the new infrastructure that they would have to put in. So they were looking to sell their property to a developer so they could get out of the farming business. And then there was one challenge left, and that was that the Issaquah Skyport was renting property from the Pickerings to have the Issaquah Skyport, which was located on this piece of property. So this became a big battle. The Pickerings sold their property to the developer, and a lot of people in Issaquah felt strongly that this Pickering Corporate Park should not happen. And a lot of people felt strongly that the Skyport should be retained. And so this gave rise to a couple of organizations, the Greater Issaquah Coalition, also called GIC or GIC, and the Issaquah Environmental Council, or the IEC. I don't know if they called themselves the IC or not. I'm sorry, I wish I could tell you that. The residents a lot of the residents banded together to fight the Skyport, and there were kind of two things that they wanted to have happen. They wanted to be able to pass an election bill that said that there would be a skyport in Issaquah, and then there was another bill that said, you know, that the funding would be provided. Well, everybody voted for the skyport, but not for the funding portion. And then of course, Ruth was very concerned about the water. And as we can see, Issaquah Creek runs right through the section that was slated for development. This is what they were picturing at the time. This is not what is currently there. What is currently there now is Costco, but this is what they were envisioning at the time. So the creek would have been flowing right through here, and they would have had all these different kind of corporate areas staked out where people could purchase property and locate their business. So as I said, a lot of the participants in this battle were actively fighting for the skyport, but Ruth was also fighting against development. So the business park, of course, meant more asphalt, which she did not approve of. More asphalt means more impermeable surfaces, more runoff. The Issaquah Creek, of course, ran right through this area. And so the area nearby was a wetlands that she felt should be preserved. And obviously this whole area was going to be impacted by the development. So Ruth Kees joined forces with Lynn Emmerich, who was the owner and operator of the Issaquah Skyport. And they became kind of partners in supporting these two organizations, the Greater Issaquah Coalition and the Issaquah Environmental Council. So the GIC and the IEC, these two organizations, both filed a lawsuit against the city of Issaquah saying that they should not have approved this temporary permit, in short. So this filled the newspapers and the city council records for several years. So I'm doing a lot of simplifying here. If you wanted to dive into that subject, it would make a great thesis if anybody's looking for a thesis topic. So the materials that were put out by the Greater Issaquah Coalition really encouraged folks to make contributions to their legal fund, and it really focused on the floodplain. One of the things they pointed out was like, you know what, the city council doesn't really know where the floodplain is. That was one of the arguments that they made. And of course, they were concerned with salmon habitat and overall water supply issues. And then in November of 1986, something happened which probably should not have been too surprising since there'd been a flood in 1983. There was a massive storm in Issaquah and a great deal of flooding, and a lot of that flooding centered around the Pickering Farm site. You can see here, this is the Pickering barn. This is standing water. This was a picture that was taken by the Issaquah Press at that time. Lynn Emmerich, of course, had access to an airplane, so he hopped in his airplane and took to the sky and took a number of aerial photographs. If you look at this photo down here at the bottom, you see the Issaquah or Pickering barn and the hay barn over here in front of it. And then you can see all this water basically surrounding it throughout all the fields. So, and if you need a little help figuring out where exactly the creek is, this is the general path of the creek. It's running this way, heading for Lake Sammamish. And this is one of the images that Lynn Emmerich took. Shortly after the flooding, there was a large newspaper article in the Issaquah Press about how citizens who were impacted by flooding from Issaquah Creek were getting together to try and decide what sort of action should be taken. And so accompanying that article was this picture of Ruth Kees and Fred Nystrom walking through the Issaquah Creek, or near the Issaquah Creek. So Fred Nystrom lived in the Sycamore development, which had the Issaquah Creek running right through it, and of course had been impacted by flooding. So what finally happened, as I said, this subject went back and forth in the newspapers and the Issaquah City Council materials for several years. And what finally happened is that the developers waged a countersuit against Ruth and her husband. And the kind of suit that they filed was called a SLAP, and it stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. So Ruth was desperately trying to participate publicly and to do everything she could in her power to get this development not to happen. And so this strategic lawsuit against public participation basically said, we're going to sue you if you don't stop talking about this. And so at that point, Ruth and her husband were $86,000 in debt, and they could not afford to continue the suit. And so in 1987, the Issaquah Environmental Council and the Greater Issaquah Coalition both settled with the city of Issaquah, and the suit went away. And several years later, in 1990, once again, there was flooding. Not to say that the flooding would have disappeared if they had preserved the Pickering Park site. But one of the things that Ruth said was, we were $86,000 in debt and we didn't see any way out. They didn't let anything die. So finally, we saved the 12 acres in Pickering Barn. At least that was what was given to us. So in reading Ruth Kees' oral history, you really get a sense that she was the kind of person that focused on the things that she had not yet done rather than the things that she had completed. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But since I was going through this and thinking about, well, when were the most significant floods in Issaquah, I happened to find this handy information on one of the city's websites. So significant floods have occurred in 86, 90, 96, 2009, and 2020, with the two worst being February 1996 and January 2009. So if you're curious, that's how they stack up in the recent rankings. So Ruth went on to be inducted into the Issaquah Hall of Fame. She also received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Issaquah Environmental Council, and she was the first recipient of Issaquah's Ruth Kees Award for a sustainable community. And that has become an annual award, and the 2021 recipient will be announced close to, I believe, Earth Day. But as I said, in the oral history that we conducted with her in 2006, which was just 3 years before her death, it was clear that Ruth continued to contemplate what she saw at worst as failures and at best as work left undone. She was not the type to dwell on isolated victories. And so some of the things that she had to say I thought were really interesting. So regarding the development of Lake Sammamish State Park, she said, I wish I had enough left to go fight that park because I think this is an essential way for the native kokanee to get back into the stream. So this was at a time when the Friends of Lake Sammamish State Park were beginning to get together, and there was discussion about how to get more visitors at the park. So part of the reason this happened, which if we can go way back into deep history, parks were really hurting. They did not have enough funding anymore because of one of the initiatives that Tim Eyman had encouraged to go through. That had resulted in a hole in the state parks budget. And so parks like the Lake Sammamish State Park and other parks in the area were trying to figure out ways that they could generate additional income so that they could keep up with operations. And so Ruth was not thrilled with the idea of more people coming to Lake Sammamish State Park and the park being further developed, because she felt as a passive park, it was a better place for the kokanee salmon and other kinds of salmon to come to spawn and pass through. And so you have to remember that the mouth of the Issaquah Creek is located in Lake Sammamish State Park. And so that's one of the first places that, we start impacting the creek. And of course, the Issaquah Highlands, she said, I've turned my back on that development up there because it's over and done with now, and we're just going to have to suffer the consequences. 26% of the recharge of Issaquah's aquifers come from the Highlands. It's going to take a long time before the groundwater is really going to be affected by it, but I think it will be. And one of the things she said that I felt like I really resonated with, but also made me really sad, was there are so many things you can look into, you can splatter yourself all over, and I wonder if I've done any good at all. And I think that we can all agree that she probably did so much more than she gave herself credit for. So next week, when we send out a little recap of the program, I'll include links to Ruth Kees' oral history so that if you're really interested in what some of the things that she had to say and some of the things she was concerned about, you can go take a look at that. And like I said, we've got a lot of materials in our collections about the Greater Issaquah Coalition that are just there for folks to dive into. So I am happy to say that before her death, Ruth made arrangements for a large chunk of the property that she and her husband owned to be purchased by the state of Washington. And so now part of that is in conservation up on Tiger Mountain. And so that's a look at the amazing Ruth Kees. And so segueing, we promised you guys some hikes. We have a little bit of hike information. And hopefully you'll seek out more. I cannot recommend highly enough the Washington Trails Association's website and all their hike listings. And so we'll include links to their site for the hikes that we're going to talk about now. So three of these are hikes that Tom recommended. He recommended several others and noted that he likes to string them all together in a 6-mile loop hike. So that said, there are tons of great trails on the Tradition Plateau. So if you don't see something here that strikes your fancy, I'm sure you can find something. So first of all, the Ruth Kees Big Tree Trail. It's only a mile round trip, 110 feet gain. The big tree in question is a Douglas fir that somehow survived all the logging that has taken place in the 20th century. The trunk is 9 feet in diameter, and its lowest branches start about 75 feet above the ground. And it's thought to be between 200 and 400 years old. So if trees could talk, what a lot of interesting things that tree could tell us. The bus trail. This is a photograph of me and my children. We are not really hurt. My kids thought it would be funny if we pretended to stagger out of the wrecked bus. So that's why we look like that. I also don't have to worry about copyright if I use my own images. Hot tip for you. So this abandoned bus is on Tiger Mountain. It is on the south side of Lake Tradition on what's called the Bus Line Trail. So easy to find. So often it's identified as a Greyhound scenic cruiser that has been crashed. But some of our volunteers figured out that no, it is actually a 1930 Kenworth split level bus. So now you know, in case you've been arguing about that with someone. How did it end up on Tiger Mountain? Well, a lot of the trails on Tiger Mountain were used as logging trails initially. And so logging companies would use buses like this to haul their crews up to the mountain to do work. And at some point, they just decided not to take the bus back with them. So by 1954, it had been abandoned, left on its side, and salvagers had yanked out the engine and tires. So that's the bus trail. And the Swamp Monster Trail. So this is a self-guided adventure where your heroine, Zoe, meets some swamp-dwelling denizens and learns more about the actual area. Is there a swamp monster? We don't know. You might have to take the hike to find out. And finally, this is my pick. This is not one of Tom's picks. This is the Bullet Access Trail. So up at the top of Squaw Mountain is the Bullet Lodge. It was built by Stimson Bullet, who was a media kind of icon and tycoon in Seattle in the 1940s and 50s. So he built the lodge as a weekend retreat in 1952. It was not used very often, and it soon fell into disrepair, and there was a fire there. So by 1972, it had pretty much dwindled down to just this chimney. And 1972 is when the Bullet family donated 590 acres to form the Squaw Mountain State Park. So that's where we get that particular state park from. So that is the end of our super brief hiking section, and it's the end of our program. I hope that you will consider joining us in just 2 short months to attend a program tentatively titled What Was Where. So if you're curious about the layout of Issaquah over time, what it looked like at certain eras, what different maps looked like in different time periods, when the street names changed, why the street name changed, you might be interested in joining us for this program. You might also be interested in checking out our website, which has articles on a variety of historic topics and a search function. And you should definitely follow us on social media because we post all kinds of fabulous stuff on a regular basis, and we would love your interaction and feedback there. And so I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to stop sharing. And you can either raise your hand or you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question or share something. I know we have folks here who probably have memories and info that they would like to share too. So I'll open it up to that. Doug. You're on mute, Doug. Make sure you unmute yourself before you start talking.
Unmute.
There we go. Now you're unmuted. I have the same problem.
I just wanted to mention that kind of a little known part of Ruth's work was that you mentioned all the trails up at Lake Tradition, and she was primarily responsible with a few others for the fact that we can hike up there and it isn't covered with houses.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions, comments, contributions? We have one Sammy left if anyone wants to buy a Sammy.
Yeah, we have one left, and we're talking about salmon, so it's quite relevant. Ah,
And
there
there's
he is.
Sammy making an appearance. Yay!
Yeah, how cute. And
So, yeah.
the company that makes Sammy does not make them anymore, so
there's
the
only one
last
Sammy left,
known
guys.
Sammy.
Yeah.
So I have a question for Douglas. So I wonder Douglas, what you think as far as the earthquake possibilities, for a big earthquake. I know we get little ones often, but for something more substantial.
Am I still unmuted?
Nope, you're talking. We can hear you.
Okay, good. Well, people always worry about the big one. Geologists define the big one as 9.0 to 10.0. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the Richter scale, every point the Richter scale goes up is an earthquake that is 1,000 times more powerful than the one before it. So by the time you get up to 9 or 10, you're talking about a very significant earthquake. And in the geologic history of Issaquah in the Northwest, we find that there is a major earthquake of 9 to 10 about every 500 years. And the last one was in 1700, the year 1700. So we are only about a little over 300 years into the time period between the major quakes. So I'm not particularly concerned about a huge earthquake, destroying Issaquah or the Northwest or anything like that, because I probably, frankly, will be long gone by the time it happens. But so my kids, their grandkids will have to worry about it. But earthquakes like the Nisqually quake were caused by pressure between the North American plate and the Pacific plate, crunching and destroying slowly the Juan de Fuca plate. And the Juan de Fuca plate, of course, without getting too much into geology, has many fractures in it, and one of those fractures caused the Nisqually quake in the early 2000s. So that was a fairly minor quake, just a little over 6, and you have to realize it caused over $4 billion in damage. So think what a 9.0 or a 10.0 would do. Some of our buildings are designed in Issaquah to withstand 7.0 to 8.0 quakes, but nothing can be built that will handle a 9.0 or quake. For instance, the Columbia Center is designed to sway 11 feet in any direction. So you might be a little nauseous at the top during the earthquake, but at least you know the building won't fall over. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. This was a really fun program. I learned a lot. Geology and hydrology is not my usual gig, so I have a renewed appreciation for all of that stuff now. And definitely a renewed appreciation for Ruth Kees and her work. So, all right, well, thank you all.
I would add too that Ruth was a neighbor of mine, and she would call me and ask me to come over on different topics. And her dining room table was stacked about a foot high, and she wrote everything longhand. And she would write out these long letters to the city council and to all regional legislators. And she would come before the city council almost every meeting. And she was well respected, and she was listened to, but she worked so hard, and it was amazing, and just dedicated so much. So she was an amazing person. She was her recognition was well deserved.
Well, I was thinking as we were talking about just from the geology perspective of how we are also very, very tiny. And then to the idea of one person being able to do so much in her lifetime.
She
And
worked
I think that's
hard.
an interesting contrast in this program.
But we were sole source, water source was our aquifer for
Right.
the city of Issaquah. So the Highlands, Montreux, they have Seattle water.
Mm.
And so she was just a steward of that aquifer. And
Mm-hmm.
she pointed me to sit on a board at one time. It was the Groundwater Aquifer Commission or something. And Ruth Kees was on the same one. And
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, the hydrology was very important, still is.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It was good.
All right. Thank you, Marilyn. Thanks for coming. Thank
Thanks.
you, everyone. Have a good rest of your evening.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.